Hey, we're here at Gen Con 50, and I am with Paul Stormberg. Paul, great to have you here.
Thank you, sir.
Tell us a little bit about Legends of Wargaming and the significance of Horticultural Hall and the exhibits that we have.
Sure. Horticultural Hall is, of course, the site of the first Gen Con. I had been coming to conventions for a while, like Gary Con, and when I came to them, it was nothing but role-playing games. And I thought it was kind of a shame that a convention dedicated to Gary Gygax, who loved war games, didn't have many war games at it. So I decided there was a lot of attention on role-playing, and I would start bringing back some of the games that Gary and all of his buddies were playing up to the creation of the D&D game. And so we bring up all sorts of vintage equipment and rules, and we even bring up some vintage people, the actual players and co-authors of games that Gary wrote and released. And I wanted to bring all of these old guys so we could capture the experience of early Gen Cons. And one of Gary's old-time players said, the first time I walked into the Legends of Wargaming room, I almost cried because it was so much like the brotherly and friendly environment of wargamers crouched over games, shoulder to shoulder, and having a great time.
So, Paul, for a lot of the people newer to the whole experience, tell us a little bit more of some of the people you're mentioning and also some of the games and what makes those significant from the historical perspective, but just in general.
Sure. Well, probably the best example is Mike Carr. Mike Carr's been to every Gen Con since 1968, and he was just a high school kid, and he had this World War I tactical airplane game called Fight in the Skies. And he devised this just for he and his friends to play. And Gary was always willing to encourage young people and new people to come into the hobby. And he took Mike Carr under his wing and he said, hey, this is a pretty fun game. It has potential. You should publish this. And this is a high school kid, and he's thinking, I just wrote this for me and my friends to goof around with. But Gary actually cultivated and curated that desire for him to get that thing published, and he did eventually publish it. And it has been played at every Gen Con since. It was published by Guide on Games, self-published by Mike Carr himself. It was published by Guide on Games, and ultimately it was published by TSR as Dawn Patrol in the early 80s. And it has been played at every Gen Con since 1968. There are people who say that Mike would just be waiting at the morning, and they would run it as they called it Dawn Patrol was the event title. It was Fight in the Skies was the game, but it was called Dawn Patrol because Mike would literally be at the door at 7 a.m. for the players. And I don't know if you've been, I know you've been to Gen Con and you're probably as tired as I am, but when you're at Gen Con, you are worn ragged, and there is no way you are getting up for a 7 a.m. game. But those war gamers back in the day, they were dedicated, and they were there and couldn't wait to play Mike's game.
That's awesome. Tell me a little bit about some of the other featured historical war games that you guys have at the Legends of Wargaming area.
All right, well, these are all the games that these guys played leading up to the creation of Dungeons & Dragons. And there was a lot of elements of role-playing, just like Dungeons & Dragons in these games. And there was a lot of spectacle. They used beautiful miniatures and dioramas. And, of course, they used chainmail, which was, a long-time favorite of theirs. And one of the favorite games to play on the sand table in Gary's basement, which is a big 6-foot by 10-foot table, was chainmail. And here today at Legends of Wargaming, we have actually brought a full-size 6-foot by 10-foot sand table full of sand. It weighs about 850 pounds, and that is the table that we're using to run chainmail, which is a game Gary co-authored with Jeff Perrin. We're also playing Tractics, which is a World War II armor game that was co-written by Gary. One of the other games, Fight in the Skies, of course, is being played. They're having their annual Fight in the Skies Open that they always run at Gen Con, and they have ever since the beginning. They have a big table set up, and there's about 28 guys surrounding the table, all with the original 1/72nd plastic scale model airplanes, just like they used back in 1968.
Give me the significance of the sand table, because I think a lot of people come at more modern wargaming and strategy games with foam boards and more of like a fixed train table setup or hex grids or square. But what's the significance of the sand table, and how is it used, I guess, effectively for these games?
Sure. Well, Gary really thought the sand table was the Cadillac of wargaming tables. I mean, there were a lot of guys who had wooden blocks and plaster hills, and there wasn't quite the availability of styrofoam to mold into whatever you want. So it required paper mache and that sort of thing, much like scratch building for model railroads, train building for model railroads. But the problem with those is they're very fixed, and you're limited in just how flexible you can be. And also it takes time, and you have to store them in boxes, and it can be a little inconvenient to have to haul all that stuff around. But if you can install a sand table in your game room, which I don't know how many wives would let their husbands do that. Well, maybe there's some ladies out there who want to install one for their husband.
Sure.
So the great thing about it is we come up, for example, our sand table has 8 5-gallon buckets. We bring seven full buckets of dry sand and 1 empty bucket. And what that empty bucket for is for us to find some faucet in the convention facility where we go and get 5 gallons of water, and we add that 5 gallons of water to the sand, mix it all together, and then you can mold it just like sand on a beach. And that's the true great ability of the sand table, is you can make hills and mountains and rivers and roads. You can add a little sprinkle of green flocking to make it look like grass. You can add moss and little trees, and it has a very natural look to it. And just as soon as you're done with that game, you can turn it all over and mix it in. And I was worried when I first started with my sand table. I was like, well, we're going to have to pick all this stuff out. And they said, it'll probably take you 10 years to build up enough weird stuff in there to have to take it out. And, of course, my favorite story is whenever Gary's first wife, Mary Jo, was mad at him, she would let the cats out in the basement, and they would run down to the sand table. And, Gary didn't want to find those landmines in his World War II battlefield.
Oh, I don't think so. That would not be something that you could easily fit into the strategy.
But there is one other interesting thing I'd like to share with the sand table is kind of the main reason Gen Con is here is because Gary wanted wargamers to all come together to play with him at Gen Con. But I would say the other reason is that because of the success of D&D, obviously it propelled Gen Con to become the massive show that it is today. And of course, it brought in a lot of other vendors to make it even better. But Dungeons & Dragons, the DNA of the game Dungeons & Dragons is right in the sand table. And I can explain a little bit more about that when we get to the sand table, if you like.
Sure. Give me an overview as people head into this exhibit. This is not something that you guys do every year, right? So walk me through briefly, what is this museum? What does it feature? What kind of things do people get to see as we take a stroll through it?
All right. Well, this whole thing is the brainchild of John Peterson. And he wrote a book, Gaming at the World, just a couple years ago, and is a bit of a historical retrospective on how we went from wargaming to role-playing games. And there's a lot of history of Gen Con itself in here, and he decided that we needed to do something special for the history of Gen Con 50. And so he wanted all of us to pitch in and add to the experience to the point where they built this amazing front portico of Horticultural Hall. Now, Horticultural Hall was actually the site of the first Gen Con. It's very interesting how Gary really wanted to bring people from all over the world to come game with him. And Gen Con is really the epitome of that because Gary didn't drive. He didn't ever drive. When he was young, there's a story about him taking his father's 39 Nash out and maybe having a bit too harrowing of an experience, and he just never drove. So his choice for the first location of Gen Con was literally 1 block away from his house. And then later, when they expanded, it was only a couple more blocks from his house. So all of the Gen Cons, the first Gen Cons, through the 70s were walking distance from Gary's house. And yet people were coming all the way from Oregon to come game. But very first Gen Con, a man named Jerry White came all the way from Portland, Oregon to play a game. And that's the true power of Gary, was that he had this real cult of personality. He would say he would write 12 to 24 letters and postcards a day just to connect with the outside. I mean, there was no internet. Yeah. And that was the way he created a web of gamers and a family of gamers. And so that was his idea behind the first GaryCon, was to be able to bring people from all the way around. So this guy named Jerry Bodenberg he was a captain in the U.S. Army, and he brought a little game called Siege of Bodenberg. And we have that today as part of our Legends of Wargaming. Siege of Bodenberg was played at the first Gen Con. It uses elastilin figures from a company named Hauser, and these figures are all beautiful, bright colored, and it comes with a big vacuum formed castle, and it really has a lot of spectacle to it. And Gary and his best friend Bill Hoyer, well, his good friend Bill Hoyer, he and Bill played that game, and boy, Gary was smitten. He just thought that game was so neat. As a matter of fact, he thought it was so cool that the next day they were supposed to be cleaning up and moving everything out of the convention, out of the Horticultural Hall. They were supposed to stack up all the tables and sweep the floors. So Gary says, we positioned somebody at the front door and had them sort of pretend to sweep around the front door as the Horticultural Hall people were walking by asking if they were done yet, and occasionally they'd move a chair or a table. All the while, way in the back of the Horticultural Hall, they were still playing Siege of Bodenberg.
That's awesome. Well, Paul, let's take a quick segue, and we'll go check out what we have as the feature items in this retrospective in the museum.
Sure, you bet. Horticultural Hall is a big hall in Lake Geneva that was a place of flower shows and antique shows and that sort of thing. They had this beautiful portico entryway, and then there was this little section which these windows led in the library. As you went into the door of the main entrance of the place, you would come into an area that was the main hallway. And the main hall was a parquet floor that extended all around the room. This replica, all the area that is carpeted, that encompasses the museum, represents the main hall of Horticultural Hall. And in this area, they would have all sorts of games during Gen Con set up with tables and chairs. In fact, the parquet floor was set up in 1-foot squares and then subdivided, because it was a parquet floor, into pieces of wood. And you can see pictures of people playing war games in Horticultural Hall, and they're actually playing right on the floor using that as their wargaming grid. So the hall extends all through this area here, and way back on the far corner would have been the kitchen, where the Gygax children and Mary Jo Gygax, Gary's first wife, would serve hot dog and sunshine sodas to the hungry and thirsty gamers. This is an Alaskan Castle made by a company called Hauser. Hauser was a German company that before World War I made little composition figures. The figures had wire armatures and were made with a composition of glue and sawdust. After World War II, the Germans had all of these machines for making injection molded plastic parts for their war machine. But after the war, they had no more use for making those war machines, but they had all of these hardened steel die machines and plastic injection molding equipment. And it's hard to destroy those with bombs, so even if they wrecked the factory, those pieces were still left over. So after the war, they decided to use these to make toys. And injected plastic molding eventually took over the making of elastilin figures. But the elastilin figures were made out of an orange plastic. And the orange plastic came unpainted and was pretty boring. It was meant to kind of look flesh-colored. The other unfortunate consequence of World War II is there were a lot of German war widows. And these women had families still to raise, and their husband had been killed in the war. And so they needed a job. And one of the jobs they got was working for the Hauser Company as painters. And there were whole legions of these women that would be taught to paint the figures all in a same pattern. And so you can get a handful of these elastilin figures from the day, and they might be made by 30 different war widow women. After Gen Con 1, Gary was so smitten with the medieval miniatures that he had played with the elastilins in Siege of Bodenberg, and he didn't have a lot of money at the time, but he wanted to be able to get a bunch of those miniatures together and start playing them. Well, Gary had created, along with Scott Duncan and Bill Spear, the IFW, the International Federation of Wargamers. And they all had subgroups for different interests of wargaming. So Gary decided to create his little group now that he was interested in medieval miniatures, and that group was called the Castle and Crusade Society. The Castle and Crusade Society was probably never more than about 80 people. As people contributed to the society and helped it to grow more and more, they were given higher and higher ranks. Of course, a young boy who Gary took under his wing very early on, Rob Kuntz, who is only a young teenager, he made Castle of the Society, King Rob Kuntz of the Castle and Crusade Society. And Gary made himself the Duke of Walworth, which is the location of the original Gen Con in Lake Geneva. And then each of them made up their own heraldry, which represented their sort of persona in the Castle and Crusade Society. As they played out scenarios on the sand table in the basement, they would set it up and break it down, and they would play out what was happening in the imaginary great kingdom of the Castle and Crusade Society. And depending on how much you contributed to the society, determined whether you had holdings or military or title or land. And so really the entire campaign played out on the pages of their fanzine, the Domesday Book, and on the sand table itself. The ping pong table behind me belonged to Dave Arneson, and it is the ping pong table that the first role-playing game, Blackmoor, was played on. It was also the table where they played the precursor to Blackmoor by David Wesley called a Braunstein. And a Braunstein was a bit of mix of wargaming with a judge and a mix of role-playing, and it became something that Dave Arneson wanted to experiment with a little bit, and eventually it led to Blackmoor, which is the first fantasy role-playing game. As part of the Castle and Crusade Society, and as sort of an afterthought to Chainmail, Gary added a little jousting game at the end of Chainmail, and it's literally just one page, but it is a very fun, engaging game. This setup here is just an imagined jousting setup, but when they played it in the day, they would send their jousting orders by mail, and then the other person would send their jousting orders by mail, and they would compare it and see who won. As a matter of fact, at one point, Rob Kuntz shows himself jousting and knocking the king's helm off in a jousting match, and it says, "Damn, I should have leaned right." This is a recreation of a Siege of Bodenberg game. It's using original figures and the original castle. It's laid out just as Henry Bodenstadt would want it to have been laid out, with dozens and dozens of figures on it. But when it was actually played at Gen Con 1, Jerry White couldn't afford to buy all of the figures, so they used markers to represent, or had some of the figures represent more than one. But this is pretty much the setup of what it would have looked like at that very first Gen Con back in 1968.